Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one no one notices. Sometimes the quietest voice carries the most power. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Northwood Academy, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Lenora Finch adjusted the worn leather strap of her messenger bag as she navigated the crowded hallway, her auburn hair catching occasional glints of sunlight. To anyone watching, she was just another face in the crowd, a 17-year-old girl trying to blend into the background of one of Connecticut's most prestigious private schools. But appearances, as they say, can be devastatingly deceiving. Lenora had perfected the art of invisibility over the past 2 years at Northwood. Keep your head down, speak when spoken to, and never, ever draw attention to yourself. It was a survival strategy her mother had taught her when they first arrived from Dublin, when everything was new and frightening and different. Stay unnoticed. Love. Her mother, Siobhan, had whispered during those first difficult weeks. Sometimes being invisible is the safest way to be. If you're feeling that rush of what's going to happen next, hit that like button. It really helps more people discover these stories. And if you want to share where you're watching from, drop it in the comments below. For those who want to support more stories like this one, there's a thanks button right under this video. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps me bring you more inspiring tales of courage and standing up for what's right. Thank you for being here. Now, let's see what happens when push comes to shove. What her mother hadn't mentioned was how exhausting it could be. Carrying yourself like a shadow day after day. The hallway buzzed with the familiar sounds of teenage life locker doors slamming, sneakers squeaking against the floor, fragments of conversations about weekend parties and upcoming tests. Lenora moved through it all like water, fluid and unremarkable. Until she reached her destination, the small coffee cart near the library where Mrs. Patterson, the elderly librarian, sold decent coffee for $2 a cup. It was a luxury Lenora allowed herself once a week, a small comfort that reminded her of the cafe near their old flat in Dublin, where she and her mum would share a scone on Sunday mornings. The usual. "Dear," Mrs. Patterson asked with a warm smile that reached her eyes, one of the few genuine smiles Lenora encountered at her during her school days. "Please," Lenora replied, fishing 2 crumpled dollar bills from her jacket pocket. The jacket was new, or at least new to her. She'd saved for 3 months, working extra shifts at her aunt's bakery, to afford the soft gray wool coat that hung perfectly on her small frame. It was the first piece of clothing she'd owned that didn't come from a thrift store or a hand-me-down pile. She took the steaming cup carefully, inhaling the rich aroma, when the universe decided to test her invisibility strategy. "Watch it!" The voice cut through the morning chatter like a blade. Lenora looked up to see Bradley Sterling, 6 feet 2 inches of entitled privilege, his dark blonde hair perfectly styled, his varsity basketball jacket pristine. He was flanked by his usual companions, Theodore Quinn, all sharp angles and sneering grins, and Bethany Cartwright, whose beauty was matched only by her capacity for cruelty. Lenora had been so focused on not spilling her coffee that she hadn't noticed Bradley's sudden stop in front of her. The hot liquid had splashed against his designer sneakers, leaving a dark stain on the white leather. "I'm so sorry," Lenora said quickly, reaching for the napkins Mrs. Patterson was already extending. "I didn't see. Bradley's voice rose, drawing attention from nearby students. "How do you not see someone right in front of you?" The hallway began to quiet. That peculiar silence that falls when teenage predators sense weakness. Lenora felt dozens of eyes turning toward them, felt the weight of unwanted attention settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. "I said I was sorry," she repeated, her Irish accent becoming more pronounced under stress, as it always did. "I can pay for cleaning." "Can you?" Theodore chimed in, his phone already out, angled toward the scene. Everything was content to him. Every moment of human discomfort a potential viral video. "These shoes cost more than your entire outfit." Lenora felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "Then tell me how much." Bradley studied her for a moment, his head tilted slightly, like a predator sizing up prey. There was something calculating in his blue eyes, something that made Lenora's instincts sharpen despite her outward calm. "You know what?" he said finally, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Forget it. Accidents happen, right?" The words should have been reassuring, but the tone sent a chill down Lenora's spine. She nodded, gathered her things, and walked away, feeling their eyes on her back like physical weight. What she didn't see was the look Bradley exchanged with his friends, or the way Theodore's finger hovered over the record button on his phone. She didn't hear Bethany whisper, "Fresh meat?" or see the predatory grins that spread across their faces. Sometimes mercy is just cruelty in disguise. The rest of the morning passed without incident. Lenora sat through her AP history class, where Mr. Evans droned about the Industrial Revolution while staring primarily at the back wall. She took careful notes in her precise handwriting, answered questions when called upon, and faded back into comfortable anonymity. But at lunch, anonymity became a luxury she could no longer afford. The cafeteria at Northwood was a carefully orchestrated social ecosystem. Popular kids claimed the tables nearest the windows, where the natural light was best and their conversations could be overheard by anyone seeking proximity to power. Academic achievers gathered around the central tables, their discussions a mixture of upcoming assignments and college applications. Everyone else filled in the spaces between, finding their own small tribes in the vast social landscape. Lenora typically sat alone near the back corner, a strategic position that allowed her to observe without being observed. She'd brought lunch from home, a simple sandwich and an apple, because the cafeteria prices were designed for students whose parents didn't worry about grocery budgets. She was halfway through her sandwich when Bradley Sterling appeared at her table. "Mind if we sit?" he asked, though he was already pulling out a chair. Theodore and Bethany followed suit, their lunch trays loaded with the premium options Lenora couldn't afford. "Actually," she began. "Great," Bradley interrupted, settling into his seat with the casual confidence of someone who'd never been told no. "So, about this morning, I've been thinking." Lenora set down her sandwich, her appetite suddenly gone. Around them, conversations continued, but she could feel the subtle shift in attention, the way nearby tables grew quieter, students straining to hear without appearing to listen. "Those shoes," Bradley continued, cutting into his grilled chicken with practiced precision. "They're limited edition, $300, and they don't make them anymore." "I offered to pay for cleaning," Lenora said quietly. "Cleaning won't fix them," Theodore added, his phone positioned discreetly on the table, screen facing her. "Leathers stained permanently." Bethany leaned forward, her voice honey-sweet with underlying venom. "The thing is, we all know you can't actually afford to replace them. I mean, that jacket you're wearing, cute, but definitely not designer. And your bag is that from Goodwill." The words hit their mark. Lenora's hand moved unconsciously to her jacket, the wool that had felt so soft and new this morning now seeming inadequate under their scrutiny. "So here's what we're thinking," Bradley said, his voice reasonable, almost friendly. "Since you can't pay us back with money, maybe you can pay us back another way." "What do you mean?" "Community service," he said with a grin. "You work at a bakery, right? Your aunt's place on Maple Street. Maybe you could bring us some free pastries. Think of it as restitution." The request seemed almost innocent, but Lenora understood the subtext. This wasn't about compensation, it was about establishing control, about making her complicit in her own humiliation. "I can't just take things from my aunt's shop," she said. "Can't?" Bradley's eyebrows rose. "Or won't?" The distinction hung in the air between them. Around the cafeteria, conversations resumed their normal volume, but Lenora felt as though she were in a bubble, isolated with three predators who had somehow identified her as easy prey. "Won't," she said finally, meeting Bradley's eyes directly for the first time since the morning. It was a mistake. Something shifted in Bradley's expression, a hardening that transformed his handsome features into something colder. Theodore's finger moved over his phone screen. Bethany's smile sharpened. "Interesting," Bradley said softly, then louder. "You know, Theodore, I think our new friend here might need some time to reconsider." Before Lenora could react, Bradley's hand shot out and knocked her water bottle across the table. The water splashed across her lunch, soaking her sandwich and sending her apple rolling onto the floor. "Oops," he said, not bothering to sound apologetic. "Clumsy me." Other students turned to look now, no longer pretending disinterest. Lenora felt heat rise in her cheeks as she grabbed napkins from the dispenser, trying to salvage her ruined lunch. "Here, let me help," Bethany said, standing up with her own water bottle. "I'm so good at cleaning up messes." The water hit Lenora's bag this time, soaking her notebooks and sending droplets across her jacket. The beautiful gray wool darkened with moisture, and Lenora felt something break inside her chest, not just frustration or embarrassment, but a deep, aching sense of violation. "Stop," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stop what?" Bradley asked innocently. "We're just trying to help clean up the mess you made." Theodore's phone captured everything: her wet clothes, her ruined lunch, her flushed face, content for whatever social media platform would appreciate her humiliation most. Lenora stood up slowly, gathering her soggy belongings. She could feel the weight of dozens of stares, could hear the whispered conversations that would follow her for days. But she also felt something else stirring beneath the embarrassment, something her mother had taught her to recognize and control. "This isn't over," Bradley said as she turned to leave, his voice just loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "We'll be seeing you around, Lenora." The way he said her name like he was claiming ownership of it made her skin crawl as she walked toward the exit. Lenora passed a table where a boy with dark hair and kind eyes looked up from his sketchbook. Their gazes met for just a moment, and she saw something there, not pity, not amusement, but recognition, as if he understood exactly what had just happened and why it mattered. His name was Ethan Riley, though she didn't know it yet, and in that brief moment of connection, something shifted in the trajectory of her story. That evening, Lenora sat in her family's small apartment above Murphy's Bakery, her damp school clothes hanging in the bathroom, her notebooks spread across the kitchen table in hopes they might dry without the pages sticking together. Her mother was downstairs, closing up shop, the scent of fresh bread and cinnamon still lingering in the air. Lenora stared at her reflection in the dark window, seeing not just her own face, but the ghost of her younger self, the 9-year-old girl who had begged her mother to teach her the martial art she'd practiced back in Dublin. Why Aikido? She'd asked then. Why not karate or boxing? Because love, her mother had said, adjusting Lenora's stance in their makeshift training space in the basement. Aikido isn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It's about understanding energy, your own and your opponent's. It's about using someone's aggression against them, redirecting their force instead of meeting it head-on. But what if they're bigger than me? Size doesn't matter when you understand leverage. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. Now, staring at her reflection, Lenora remembered those lessons. She remembered the wooden dummy her mother had brought from Ireland, the countless hours spent learning to move like water, to bend without breaking, to find the still center within chaos. She remembered the philosophy her mother had drilled into her. Real power isn't having the skill to destroy your enemies. It's having that skill and choosing a wiser course. But what happened when the wiser course stopped working? What happened when invisibility became a target instead of a shield? Lenora touched her jacket, hanging nearby. The water stains had mostly dried, but she could still feel the violation of those moments in the cafeteria. Still hear the sound of Theodore's phone capturing her humiliation for posterity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. She could feel it in the way the day had ended, in the calculating look in Bradley's eyes, in the way other students had watched her leave the cafeteria. She'd been marked now, identified as someone who could be pushed around without consequence. But they didn't know about the basement training space. They didn't know about the years of discipline, the muscle memory that could turn her small frame into something formidable. They didn't know that beneath her quiet exterior lay the skills of someone who had been preparing for confrontation her entire life, even if she'd hoped never to use them. As her mother's footsteps echoed on the stairs, Lenora made a decision. She would continue trying to be invisible, continue seeking the path of least resistance. But she would also prepare for the possibility that sometimes the only way to find peace is to demonstrate why you shouldn't be disturbed. Sometimes the quiet ones are quiet because they're listening, learning, waiting, and sometimes, when pushed too far, they stop being quiet altogether. If this reminds you of someone, maybe a younger version of yourself, maybe someone you knew who carried their strength silently, you understand that the most dangerous person in any room is often the one who seems the most harmless. Because they're not harmless. They're just careful about when and how they show their true power. The next morning brought winter's first real bite to Connecticut. Lenora pulled her jacket closer as she walked to school, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. The jacket had dried overnight, but she could still feel the phantom dampness from yesterday's humiliation, still hear the echo of laughter that had followed her from the cafeteria. Northwood Academy looked different somehow in the harsh morning light, less prestigious, more predatory. The Gothic architecture that usually impressed visitors now seemed to loom over her, as if the building itself were part of the conspiracy to make her feel small. She was early, as always. The hallways were mostly empty, except for a few dedicated students heading to early study sessions or morning sports practice. Lenora preferred this quiet time, when she could navigate the corridors without feeling like prey moving through a hunting ground. But today, even the empty hallways felt dangerous. She was approaching her locker when she saw them, Bradley and Theodore, positioned near the water fountain like sentinels, waiting. Her stomach clenched, but she forced herself to continue walking. Maybe they'd ignore her. Maybe yesterday had been enough for them. She should have known better. "Well, well," Bradley called out as she approached. "If it isn't our favorite coffee spiller." Lenora kept walking, focusing on her locker combination. 2715. 2715. Just get your books and go. Rude, Theodore commented, his phone already in his hand. We're trying to be friendly here. She could feel them moving closer, could sense the shift in the hallway's energy. 2715. The lock clicked open. So, Bradley said, now close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne. Have you thought about our conversation yesterday? About the pastries? I told you, Lenora said quietly, grabbing her history textbook. I can't take things from my aunt's shop. Can't or won't. There was that distinction again, loaded with threat. Lenora turned to face them. Her textbook clutched against her chest like a shield. Won't, she said, meeting Bradley's eyes directly. It was the wrong answer. Bradley's hand shot out and slammed her locker shut. The metal crash echoing through the empty hallway. Lenora jerked back, her heart rate spiking, but she didn't run. Something in her mother's training whispered, never turn your back on a predator. You know what I think, Bradley said, stepping closer. I think you need an attitude adjustment. He reached for her textbook. And for a moment, Lenora felt muscle memory kick in, the urge to step back, to shift her weight, to prepare for the throw that would send him crashing to the ground. Her mother's voice echoed, use their momentum against them. But another voice, quieter and more careful, reminded her, not yet, not here, not unless you have no choice. She let him take the textbook. Irish, he said, reading her name from the cover label. That explains the attitude. You people are always fighting about something, aren't you? The casual racism hit like a physical blow. Theodore's phone camera captured her flinch, her moment of pain, adding it to whatever collection of humiliation he was building. Give it back, she said quietly. Give what back? Bradley asked, tossing the book to Theodore, who caught it with a grin. My book. This book. Theodore held it up, waving it just out of her reach. I don't see your name on it. Wait. He opened it, reading the label again. Lenora Finch. What kind of name is that anyway? Sounds made up. It's Irish, she said, hating how defensive she sounded. Right, Irish. Bradley rolled the word around in his mouth like something distasteful. You know what I heard about Irish people? They're all drunks. Is that true? Lenora, your family, a bunch of drunks. The question hung in the air like poison. Lenora felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest, a rage so pure it almost took her breath away. In that moment, she wanted nothing more than to show them exactly what this quiet Irish girl could do to people who pushed too far. Instead, she said, Please give me my book back. I'll be late for class. Class? Bradley laughed. You mean charity case study hall? I heard you're on scholarship. Free ride because you're… What? Poor and foreign double diversity points. Each word was a calculated cut, designed to strip away her dignity piece by piece. And the worst part was that he wasn't entirely wrong. Her scholarship was need-based, and being an immigrant had been part of her application essay. The book, she said again, her voice steady despite the storm building inside her. Theodore looked at Bradley, who shrugged. Give it back to her. Theo, we're not monsters. Theodore tossed the book, deliberately throwing it short so it hit the ground near her feet. The pages splayed open, her careful notes scattered and visible. Oops, he said. Butterfingers. Lenora knelt to gather the scattered papers, her jacket riding up slightly, revealing the worn waistband of her jeans second-hand. Like most of her clothes, she felt their eyes on her, cataloging every sign of her family's financial struggle. every detail that marked her as different. As she stood up, smoothing the wrinkled pages, Bradley leaned in close enough that she could feel his breath on her ear. "This is just the beginning," he whispered. "You think yesterday was bad, you have no idea what we can do to you." Then they were gone, their laughter echoing down the hallway like a promise of worse things to come. Lenora stood alone in the corridor, her textbook clutched to her chest, her hands shaking slightly. The morning light streaming through the tall windows no longer seemed warm. It felt harsh and exposing, illuminating every crack in her carefully constructed invisibility. But as she walked toward her first class, something else began to build alongside the fear and humiliation, something harder and more dangerous than either emotion. Her mother had taught her that every opponent reveals their strategy eventually. Bradley was showing her his systematic degradation, public humiliation, the slow destruction of her sense of safety and belonging. He was counting on her silence, on her desire to remain invisible, on her fear of making things worse. What he didn't know was that silence could be a weapon too. And sometimes, the longer you wait to use your strength, the more devastating it becomes when you finally decide you've had enough. The first real snow of the season began to fall as Lenora took her seat in AP History, each flake a tiny, crystalline reminder that winter and everything that comes with it was finally here. The days that followed blurred together like watercolors in rain. Bradley Sterling and his companions had turned harassment into an art form, each encounter more calculated than the last. They knocked books from her hands in crowded hallways, always in spots where teachers couldn't see. Theodore documented everything, building what Lenora suspected was a comprehensive archive of her humiliation for future entertainment. But something else was happening too. Something that gave her small moments of light in the growing darkness. Ethan Riley had started appearing in unexpected places. Not obviously nothing that would draw attention or make her a bigger target. But when Bradley's group cornered her near the library, Ethan would materialize nearby, sketching quietly at a table within earshot. When they trapped her by the water fountain, he'd show up to refill his water bottle, his presence somehow shifting the dynamic just enough to make them back off. He never intervened directly. That would have been social suicide for both of them. But his presence sent a message: someone is watching. Someone cares. It was Thursday afternoon when everything changed. Lenora was walking to her locker after art class, her mind still processing the afternoon's lesson about negative space. How sometimes what you don't include is more powerful than what you do. She was so absorbed in the concept that she almost didn't notice the small group gathered around her locker until it was too late. Bradley stood at the center, holding something that made Lenora's heart stop. Her jacket. Her beautiful gray wool jacket that she'd saved 3 months to buy. He held it up like a trophy, examining the fabric with exaggerated interest. "Nice jacket," he said as she approached, his voice carrying that familiar tone of false appreciation. "Real wool. Right, must have cost you. What, your entire paycheck?" "Put it down," Lenora said quietly. But her voice carried something new, a warning that hadn't been there before. "Put it down," Bradley laughed. "But I'm just admiring it. The craftsmanship, the attention to details." He turned to Theodore, who was filming as always. "What do you think? Theo, good quality?" Theodore moved closer, the camera capturing every detail. "Hard to tell from here. Maybe if we could see the construction better." Before Lenora could react, Bradley gripped the jacket with both hands and pulled. The sound of tearing fabric cut through the hallway noise like a scream. Students turned to look as the shoulder seam gave way. the beautiful gray wool splitting along the carefully stitched lines. "Oops," Bradley said, not sounding sorry at all. "Guess the quality wasn't as good as it looked." Lenora stared at the destroyed jacket. At 3 months of extra shifts and careful saving, reduced to ruined fabric in seconds. Something cracked inside her chest, not her heart, but something deeper. The careful control her mother had taught her. The philosophical restraint that had kept her hands steady and her voice calm. "You know what the problem is with people like you," Bradley continued. Warming to his audience, the hallway had grown quiet. Students sensing the shift in energy, the electricity that precedes lightning. "You come here thinking you belong, thinking you're just like us. But you're not." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper meant to carry. "You're charity, a token. And no matter how hard you try to fit in, no matter what clothes you buy or how you talk, everyone knows you don't belong here. This isn't your world, and it never will be." The words hit like physical blows, each one designed to strip away not just her dignity but her sense of place in the world around them. Students watched with the hungry fascination of those witnessing a car crash. But Lenora wasn't looking at them anymore. She was looking at her jacket, at the careful stitching her aunt had admired, now hanging in tatters. 3 months of work, 3 months of hope, destroyed in seconds by someone who would never understand what it meant to save for something that simple and necessary. "Pick it up," she said quietly. Bradley blinked, clearly not expecting resistance. "What? Pick up my jacket?" "I don't think so." His smile returned, confident and cruel. "Maybe you should pick it up. And while you're down there, maybe you should think about whether you really want to keep pushing this." That's when Lenora noticed Ethan Riley standing near the edge of the crowd. Their eyes met across the hallway. And, in that moment, she saw something that changed everything. Not pity, not sympathy, but recognition. He saw her not the victim, not the charity case, but the person she actually was beneath all the careful invisibility. And in that moment of being truly seen, Lenora made a choice. "I said, pick it up." The challenge hung in the air between them. Bradley's smile faltered slightly, confusion flickering across his features. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. "You know what?" he said, his voice rising to carry to the watching crowd. "I think you need to learn some respect." He reached for her shoulder, his hand moving to push her down toward the jacket. That's when 17 years of careful training kicked in. Lenora moved like water, like her mother had taught her. She stepped back and to the side, her hand coming up to catch Bradley's wrist. For a moment, he looked confused. This wasn't resistance. Exactly. It almost looked like she was helping him reach for something. Then she twisted. Bradley's momentum carried him forward and down as Lenora redirected his energy, using his own force against him exactly as her mother had drilled into her 1,000 times in their basement training space. His knees hit the polished hallway floor with a sound that echoed off the lockers. The hallway went dead silent. Bradley looked up from the floor, his face flushed with shock and rage. "You little—" He lunged at her from his knees, reaching for her legs. Lenora stepped back smoothly, caught his extended arm, and used his forward momentum to send him sliding across the polished floor toward the water fountain. Theodore, who had been so focused on filming, stumbled backward as his friend crashed into his legs. The phone went flying, clattering across the floor as both boys went down in a tangle of limbs. What's going on here? Principal Thompson's voice cut through the stunned silence like a blade. The crowd of students parted as he approached, his expression grim. Behind him walked Officer Martinez, the school's resource officer, drawn by the commotion. Bradley scrambled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and fury. She attacked me. That psycho attacked me for no reason. No reason. The voice belonged to Ethan Riley, who was walking toward them with Theodore's phone in his hand. Is that what we're calling destruction of property and racial harassment now? Principal Thompson's eyebrows rose. Mr. Riley. The whole thing's recorded, Ethan said, holding up the phone. Theodore was filming it. Everything Bradley said. Everything he did to her jacket. The harassment. He looked directly at Bradley. All of it. Theodore lurched forward, reaching for his phone. Give that back. That's private property. Actually, Officer Martinez said, stepping forward, if it contains evidence of harassment and intimidation, it's relevant to our investigation. He turned to Principal Thompson. Sir, I think we need to review this footage. My office, Principal Thompson said grimly. All of you, now. As the group moved toward the administrative wing, Lenora bent to pick up her ruined jacket. The fabric felt impossibly light in her hands, as if the violence done to it had somehow diminished its substance. Lenora, she looked up to find Ethan standing beside her, his expression gentle but determined. You okay? She nodded, not trusting her voice. That was incredible, he said quietly. The way you handled him, where did you learn to do that? My mother, she said simply. He smiled, and for the first time in weeks, Lenora felt something other than dread about being at school. I'm Ethan, by the way, Ethan Riley. I know who you are. Good, because I'd like to know you better, if that's okay. Maybe when all this settles down. Before she could respond, Principal Thompson's voice echoed down the hallway. Miss Finch, we're waiting. An hour later. Lenora sat in Principal Thompson's office, watching as he reviewed Theodore's phone footage for the third time. Officer Martinez stood behind him, taking notes. Across the room, Bradley slumped in his chair, his earlier bravado completely deflated. Theodore sat beside him, looking sick. Bethany had been called in as well, her usual perfect composure cracked and uncertain. Well, Principal Thompson said finally, setting down the phone, this is quite comprehensive documentation of harassment, intimidation, destruction of property, and racial abuse. He looked directly at Bradley. Mr. Sterling, in 30 years of education, I have rarely seen such a clear-cut case of systematic bullying. The footage shows weeks of escalating harassment. But she attacked me, Bradley protested. You saw it. I saw a young woman defending herself after being physically threatened. Principal Thompson replied coolly. I saw someone who showed remarkable restraint in the face of ongoing abuse. What I didn't see was an attack. Officer Martinez stepped forward. Mr. Sterling, Miss Cartwright, Mr. Quinn, you're all suspended for 2 weeks, effective immediately. The school will also be filing reports with the district and considering whether additional disciplinary action is warranted. This is ridiculous, Bethany finally spoke. Our parents will have already been called. Principal Thompson interrupted. They'll be here shortly to discuss this situation and their children's behavior. He turned to Lenora, his expression softening. Miss Finch, while I don't condone violence of any kind, the evidence clearly shows you were defending yourself against an aggressor. However, I'll need to give you a 1-day in-school suspension. District policy requires some consequence for any physical altercation. Lenora nodded. It seemed fair, and more than fair considering what could have happened. That said, Principal Thompson continued, I want you to know that this school has a zero-tolerance policy for the kind of harassment you've endured. It should never have gotten this far, and I apologize that it did. As they filed out of the office, Bradley shot her one last venomous look. This isn't over, he muttered. Officer Martinez, who was escorting him, shook his head. Son, I'd say it very much is over. Any further contact with Miss Finch will result in criminal charges. 3 days later. Lenora walked through the hallways of Northwood Academy and felt the difference immediately. Students no longer looked through her or past her. They looked at her with something she'd never experienced before. Respect. Some approached her directly, apologizing for not speaking up sooner. Others simply nodded as she passed. Small gestures of acknowledgement that said, We see you. We know what happened. You belong here. The video of the hallway confrontation had spread through the school's social networks, but not in the way Theodore had intended. Instead of being a source of entertainment, it had become evidence of something uglier, the systematic harassment of a student who had done nothing wrong except exist in a space where others felt she didn't belong. More importantly, it had shown what happened when someone finally decided they'd had enough. Lenora was putting books in her locker when someone appeared beside her. Ethan Riley, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. Peace offering, he said, holding it out to her. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small sketchbook bound in soft leather. On the cover, in elegant script, were the words, For stories worth telling. I noticed you take a lot of notes, he said. Thought maybe you'd like something nice to write in. Thank you, she said, running her fingers over the smooth leather. This is beautiful. So, he said, leaning against the locker beside hers. I was wondering if maybe you'd like to have lunch together sometime. Not as a grand gesture or anything dramatic, just as two people who'd like to know each other better. Lenora looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. Kind eyes, she'd noticed before, but also something deeper, the quiet strength of someone who chose to do the right thing even when it was inconvenient. I'd like that, she said. Good, because I brought extra lunch today, and I was hoping you might share it with me. Fair warning, though, my mom tends to overpack. You might be eating turkey sandwiches until dinner. Lenora laughed, a real laugh that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. I think I can manage that. As they walked toward the cafeteria together, Lenora felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the simple pleasure of belonging somewhere, of being wanted for exactly who she was, behind them. The hallways of Northwood Academy buzzed with the ordinary sounds of teenage life. But for Lenora Finch, the quiet girl who had found her voice when she needed it most, those sounds no longer held any threat. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to stay silent. Sometimes standing up doesn't require violence. It just requires the courage to stop accepting less than you deserve. If this story reminds you of anyone who found their strength when they needed it most, remember that the quietest voices often carry the most important messages. And sometimes, the best way to find your place in the world is to stop trying to disappear from it. 3 weeks later, Lenora's mother found her in their basement training space, moving through the flowing forms she'd practiced since childhood. But something was different now. The movements carried a new confidence, a settled strength that hadn't been there before. You look different. Love, Siobhan observed, watching her daughter's precise footwork. I feel different, Lenora replied, completing the sequence with fluid grace. I used to think being invisible was the same as being safe. But sometimes being seen, really seen, is what makes you safe. Above them, the scent of fresh bread drifted down from the bakery. a reminder of home and family and all the things worth protecting. But now Lenora knew she didn't have to protect them alone. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room really is the one no one notices, but only until they decide to be noticed. And when that moment comes, the world shifts to make room for who they've always been underneath.